esteem. Let's talk about the soft boy persona because this is where the trap really begins. When someone shows up presenting as gentle, emotionally fluent, introspective, and self-aware, esteem, most people don't question it. In fact, many of us are relieved by it. After all, for years people have been told to avoid emotionally unavailable partners, esteem, to look for someone who can talk about feelings, who seems reflective, who says things like, "I've done the work," or "I'm really in touch with my emotions." And on the surface, esteem, that sounds like growth, it sounds like safety. But here's the uncomfortable truth: emotional language is not the same thing as emotional health. Esteem. The soft boy persona isn't something that happens accidentally. It's often a carefully assembled presentation designed to create immediate trust. Sensitivity becomes the currency, esteem. Self-doubt becomes charm, vulnerability becomes proof of depth, and before you know it, you're filling in the blanks, esteem. Assuming that someone who can speak this fluently about emotions must also be capable of showing up, being consistent, and taking responsibility, esteem. But those assumptions are doing a lot of work for them. You're responding to the image, not the pattern, esteem. What makes this so tricky is that the soft boy doesn't look like the classic harmful partner people warn you about. There's no obvious arrogance, no loud entitlement, no overt dismissiveness, esteem. Instead, there's softness, hesitation, humility, even self-criticism. They may talk openly about their flaws, their fears, their wounds. That openness disarms you, esteem. It makes you feel like you're seeing the real person early on. But talking about insight and actually living it are two very different things. The persona functions like a shortcut, esteem. It allows someone to bypass the slow, necessary process of building trust through behavior. Instead of consistency over time, you're given depth upfront. Instead of reliability, esteem, you're given reflection. And because it feels intimate, you bond quickly. You believe you found someone rare, someone evolved, someone safe. But what often gets missed is this esteem. A persona can be polished, but patterns never lie. And here's where the trap tightens. Because when the behavior doesn't match the image, when there's avoidance, inconsistency, esteem, or emotional withdrawal, you don't immediately see it as a red flag. You explain it away. You tell yourself they're overwhelmed, healing, sensitive, or misunderstood. After all, esteem. They seem self-aware. They've talked like someone who cares, so you keep waiting for the behavior to catch up to the words. But a persona is not a personality. It's not character, esteem. It's not accountability, and sensitivity without responsibility isn't emotional maturity. It's camouflage, esteem. The moment you stop judging someone by how beautifully they describe emotions and start watching how they handle yours is the moment the illusion begins to crack, esteem. Because real emotional health doesn't need a performance. It shows up quietly, consistently, and without excuse, esteem. One of the most confusing parts of the soft boy dynamic is how emotionally articulate it can feel. These are people who can name every feeling in the room. Esteem, they can talk about attachment styles, childhood wounds, triggers, love languages. They sound like they've read the books, listened to the podcasts, maybe even been in therapy. Esteem. And for many people, that creates a powerful assumption. If someone understands emotions this well, they must also be capable of handling them responsibly. Esteem. But that's where the disconnect lies. Emotional depth does not automatically come with emotional responsibility. Emotional responsibility is about what you do with awareness, esteem, not how fluently you can talk about it. It's about repair after harm, consistency after connection, and accountability when your actions impact someone else, esteem. The soft boy often stops right before that part. He can analyze the dynamic endlessly, but when it comes time to show up differently, something stalls. Conversations replace change, esteem, insight replaces effort. And over time, you're left with a lot of understanding and very little stability. You may hear things like, esteem, I know I'm avoidant, or I struggle with intimacy, or I get overwhelmed and shut down. These statements can sound honest, even brave, but notice what often follows: nothing changes. Esteem. Awareness becomes a kind of permission slip. Instead of being the starting point for growth, it becomes the explanation for why growth isn't happening. Esteem. And you're subtly invited to accept less because at least they're being real about it. What makes this especially disorienting is that when you raise concerns, esteem, they don't dismiss them outright. They may validate your feelings beautifully. They might say, I understand why you'd feel that way, or your feelings make total sense. And for a moment, esteem, you feel seen. But then the pattern repeats, the same distance, the same inconsistency, the same emotional drop-offs. Validation without behavioral change can feel soothing in the moment, esteem. But over time, it becomes empty. This is where many people start doubting themselves. You think they get it, so maybe I'm asking for too much. Or they're self-aware, esteem, so maybe I just need to be more patient. But patience is not supposed to replace reciprocity, esteem. And understanding someone's inner world doesn't mean you have to tolerate being emotionally stranded in the relationship. Esteem. Emotional responsibility means recognizing when your patterns hurt someone and choosing to do something different, even when it's uncomfortable. It means making repairs, esteem, setting follow through, and accepting that your sensitivity does not exempt you from impact. When someone can talk endlessly about emotions but cannot sustain care, consistency, esteem, or accountability, that's not depth, it's avoidance dressed up as insight. And here's the line that matters most: insight without action isn't emotional maturity, esteem. It's just another way to stay stuck. Another layer of the softboy trap shows up through vulnerability, or at least what looks like vulnerability. You hear about the painful childhood, esteem. The past heartbreaks, the betrayals, the mental health struggles. These stories are often shared early and in great detail, creating a sense of intimacy that feels deep and immediate, esteem. And in a culture that rightly values openness, it's easy to assume this kind of disclosure is a sign of trust and emotional availability. But vulnerability, esteem, when it isn't paired with accountability, can quietly turn into a tool of control. What happens next is subtle. Once you know someone's wounds, you begin to protect them, esteem. You soften your needs, you hesitate before bringing things up. You tell yourself, esteem, they've been through so much, or I don't want to trigger them. Their fragility starts to shape the relationship, and without realizing it, you become the emotional manager, esteem. You monitor your tone, your timing, your expectations while theirs remain largely untouched. Over time, their vulnerability becomes a shield. Any challenge can be reframed as pressure, esteem. Any boundary can be interpreted as rejection. Any request for consistency can be met with withdrawal or emotional collapse. And because you've been shown their pain, esteem, you feel responsible for not adding to it. The focus quietly shifts away from mutual care and toward preserving their emotional comfort at all costs. This is where control enters, esteem, not through dominance but through delicacy. You're not being told what to do, you're being emotionally trained. Trained to be careful. Trained to minimize, esteem. Trained to overfunction so they don't have to. And if you do speak up, the response may be another wave of vulnerability, guilt, shame, self-criticism, or despair, esteem. You end up consoling the very person whose behavior hurt you. Real vulnerability creates connection and accountability. It invites empathy, yes, but it also invites growth. It says, esteem, this is where I struggle and this is how I'm working on it. Performative vulnerability stops short of that. It reveals pain without responsibility, esteem. It asks for understanding without offering change, and it can keep you locked in a cycle where your empathy is continuously leveraged against your own needs, esteem. Many people stay in these dynamics far longer than they should because they don't want to be the person who abandons someone who is hurting, esteem. But caring about someone's trauma does not mean sacrificing your emotional safety. You can have compassion without self-erasure, esteem. And it's important to remember that someone's wounds may explain their behavior, but they do not excuse its impact. If vulnerability consistently leaves you smaller, quieter, esteem, and more responsible for someone else's emotional state, that's not intimacy, it's emotional leverage, esteem. One of the clearest places the softboy trap shows itself is in the constant fog of ambiguity. Nothing is ever quite defined, esteem. The relationship exists in a gray zone where feelings are intense but clarity is elusive. You might be spending a lot of time together, sharing emotional intimacy, leaning on each other, esteem. But when it comes to labels, direction, or commitment, everything suddenly becomes complicated. And you're told that complexity equals depth, that certainty is rigid, esteem, that asking for clarity is somehow unromantic or pressuring. Ambiguity isn't accidental in these dynamics. It creates maximum emotional access with minimal responsibility, esteem. As long as nothing is named, nothing can be demanded. If you're confused, you can't point to a broken agreement. If you're hurt, it can be framed as a misunderstanding, esteem. And because the connection feels emotionally rich, you keep assuming that clarity will come later, once the timing is right, once they feel safer, once things naturally unfold, esteem. What often happens instead is that you begin doing the emotional math for both of you. You try to read between the lines. You analyze tone, timing, and texts, esteem. You look for reassurance in small gestures and tell yourself they mean more than they actually do. Meanwhile, esteem, the other person gets to enjoy the benefits of closeness without ever having to take a stand. They can lean in when it feels good and pull back when it feels hard without explanation, esteem. When you finally bring up the lack of definition, you may be met with thoughtful-sounding responses. Esteem, I just don't like labels. I want things to be organic. I don't want to rush. These phrases can sound reasonable, even emotionally evolved. But notice what they accomplish. Esteem, they keep the relationship exactly where it is, unprotected. and disproportionately costly to you. Over time, ambiguity starts to erode your sense of reality, esteem. You wonder if you're misreading things. You question whether your desire for clarity is a flaw. You may even feel guilty for wanting to know where you stand. But clarity isn't control, esteem. It's care. It allows both people to make informed choices. When someone consistently resists definition while benefiting from your emotional investment, that's not openness, that's avoidance, esteem. Healthy relationships don't thrive on confusion. They don't require you to decode meaning or tolerate chronic uncertainty. Emotional intimacy without structure can feel intoxicating, esteem, but it's also destabilizing, and the longer you stay in ambiguity, the harder it becomes to leave, because there's nothing concrete to point to, esteem, only a lingering sense that something is always just out of reach. If a relationship requires you to stay confused in order to stay connected, the confusion is not a phase. It's the design, esteem. As the dynamic unfolds, something very quiet but very powerful begins to happen. You start doing most of the emotional work. Not because you're asked outright, esteem, but because the relationship subtly trains you to. You become the one who checks in, who smooths things over, who explains your feelings gently, carefully, repeatedly, esteem. You're the one who anticipates moods, manages timing, and carries the emotional continuity of the connection. And it all happens so gradually that it can feel normal, team, like this is just what love requires. The soft boy often presents as emotionally sensitive, easily overwhelmed, or deeply introspective. And because of that, esteem, you may tell yourself that being patient, understanding, and flexible is the kind thing to do. So you adjust, you lower your expectations, you make space for their processing, their distance, esteem, their uncertainty. Meanwhile, your own needs get postponed, minimized, or reframed as something you should work on internally rather than something the relationship should respond to, esteem. This is where emotional labor quietly turns into self-abandonment. You spend more time regulating the relationship than enjoying it. You're doing the translating, the repairing, esteem, the emotional bookkeeping. If something feels off, you're the one who brings it up. If there's tension, you're the one who resolves it. And if there's distance, you're the one who bridges it, esteem. Over time, you may feel exhausted but strangely guilty for feeling that way because after all, they're sensitive, they're doing their best, esteem. What's particularly tricky is that the imbalance is often framed as growth. You're told you're learning patience, empathy, emotional maturity. And while those are valuable qualities, esteem, they're not meant to be exercised in only one direction. A healthy relationship distributes emotional effort, esteem. It doesn't rely on one person to carry the emotional weight, while the other remains largely protected from discomfort. You may also notice that when you finally express how tired you are, esteem, the conversation shifts. Suddenly you're reassuring them. You're managing their shame, their self-doubt, esteem, their fear of being too much or not enough. Your exhaustion becomes another problem you're responsible for handling delicately. And the original issue, your unmet needs, gets lost again, esteem. Emotional labor becomes a trap when it's expected but never reciprocated. When empathy flows one way. When understanding is abundant but accountability is scarce, esteem. You don't need to earn consistency by being endlessly patient. You don't need to shrink your needs to protect someone else's fragility, esteem. And you don't need to carry a relationship on your back to prove that you're loving. If you're doing all the emotional work and calling it love, esteem, it may be time to ask who the relationship is actually serving. By the time someone begins to sense that something isn't right, the deepest damage has often already been done, esteem. And it doesn't always look like heartbreak. It looks like self-doubt. After spending enough time in a soft boy dynamic, many people don't leave thinking, esteem, that relationship didn't meet my needs. They leave thinking maybe my needs were too much. And that shift is the real cost of the trap. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, esteem. Your internal compass gets recalibrated. You start questioning your instincts. When something feels off, you second-guess yourself. You wonder if you're being impatient, insecure, demanding, esteem, or unrealistic. After all, you were with someone who talked about emotions, who seemed reflective, who wasn't overtly cruel. So if you felt lonely, confused, or unseen, esteem, the conclusion turns inward. It must be you. This is where the damage disguises itself as growth. You may tell yourself you're learning to be more understanding, more flexible, esteem, more emotionally evolved, but what you're often learning is how to tolerate less clarity, less effort, less reciprocity, esteem. You're adapting to a dynamic that requires you to override your own discomfort in order to stay connected. And when self-abandonment gets framed as personal development, esteem, it becomes very hard to recognize it as harm. You might also notice a growing sense of emotional vigilance. You overthink your words. You analyze interactions long after they happen. Esteem. You look for meaning in small gestures because direct reassurance is missing. Over time, this erodes trust, not just in the other person, but in yourself. Esteem. You stop believing that your perceptions are reliable, that your desires are valid, that your emotional responses make sense. And this is why the softboy trap can be so destabilizing. Esteem. It doesn't rely on overt control or obvious mistreatment. It works by gently nudging you away from your own inner authority. By the end, you're not just grieving the relationship, esteem. You're trying to recover your sense of reality. You're asking yourself how you ended up explaining away so much, waiting so long, and doubting yourself so deeply. Esteem. Healing from this kind of dynamic isn't about becoming colder or less empathetic. It's about restoring your trust in yourself. It's about remembering that wanting consistency, clarity, esteem, and care doesn't make you needy. It makes you healthy. Esteem. And it's about recognizing that any relationship that requires you to disappear in order to stay connected is not a relationship worth keeping. Esteem. The moment you stop questioning your worth and start questioning the pattern is the moment you step out of the trap.